As a wilderness guide of almost 10 years' experience, I always prided myself on being able to handle situations the wilderness might throw at me. Years of guiding had taught me how to stay calm and make quick decisions in the face of danger, but nothing had prepared me for what happened that day on the trail. It seemed like just another morning. I was at the trailhead, checking my gear when a car pulled up. A man stepped out, pale and very disheveled, wearing a mismatched outfit. He looked out of place, like he'd stepped straight from a city sidewalk into this very remote mountain trail. I was supposed to be alone that day, but apparently a last-minute booking had changed that. I gave him a nod, wondering what he'd gotten himself into, but since he was paying for my guidance, I was here to provide that. We started off slowly, the trail meandering through thick woods, damp leaves crunching underfoot, and the air was very cool, and it was damp from a recent rain. He didn't say much, which suited me just fine. I preferred my clients to enjoy the peace and quiet, to soak up the beauty of the wild outdoors. After an hour or so, we stopped for a break, but the man couldn't seem to sit still. I shrugged it off, assuming he was just nervous. Everyone got a bit jittery on their first wilderness hike, then, as we pressed on, he started lagging behind. Normally, I would have encouraged him to keep up, but I could tell that he was struggling, and I slowed my pace, keeping an eye on him. The man seemed almost disoriented, occasionally glancing back as though something was following us up on that trail. But there was nothing there but trees and rocks, and when I asked him if he was okay, he told me he was fine. Hours passed, and we finally reached a clearing. I suggested that we take a longer break, give him time to rest, and he nodded, absently, leaning against a tree. And I noticed that he was almost shaking slightly, but I just attributed that to the chill in the air. I asked if he was okay, though it was more of a formality than a real concern, and he didn't respond. As we continued, I could sense that he was getting more agitated. His eyes darted around, fixating on shadows, looking over his shoulder more frequently. Now, I kept my distance, not wanting to crowd him, but also not sure what to make of his behavior. I figured he was just tense about being out here alone with a guide that he didn't know. But then suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. I turned to ask if he was all right, but before I could, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, trying to maintain my balance. He was wide-eyed, his face contorted with a mix of fear and anger, and he clawed at me, but I managed to sidestep him. I yelled at him, saying something like, "What the hell are you doing?" but he didn't respond. He just kept coming, screaming incoherently, and I backed away, and my heart was pounding, and the man was no longer the quiet, nervous client that I'd started the day with. He was a serious threat, and panic gripped me, but I forced myself to keep calm. My instincts kicked in, and I started thinking about survival. I moved slowly, trying to keep my distance, and as he circled me, I wondered if he was having some sort of mental breakdown. I thought about the nearest town, how far it was from there, and I knew that I had to find a way to escape, but he was blocking the path. The thought of using force crossed my mind. I had my survival knife with me, but I hesitated. The man was clearly disturbed. He was not acting rationally, and if I hurt him, it wouldn't be self-defense, not in the truest sense of the term. It would be a choice to end someone's life who might still be able to otherwise get help. And I couldn't do that, not unless it was the only option left. I backed away slowly, moving towards the edge of the clearing. He followed, still ranting, but without actually saying anything. I wished that I could read his mind and understand what had brought him to this state, but all I had was the sight of a very broken man, lost in his own nightmare. The night was closing in, and I knew that I had to make a move soon or risk getting trapped out in the dark woods. I glanced around for something to use as a non-lethal weapon, but there was nothing except a few fallen branches and rocks, which would either do nothing or actually risk seriously injuring him. There was no safe space here, no easy escape. I was completely on my own. Finally, he stopped, and for a moment it seemed like he might have calmed down. But then, he looked at me again, and that madness returned to his eyes. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't know if I could outpace him, but I had to try. I couldn't stay there any longer. Branches whipped at my face as I dashed through the underbrush, desperate to get away. My foot caught a root and I stumbled, nearly falling, but I got back up and kept going. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the forest, getting closer. I had to put distance between us. I had to survive. All I could do was put one foot in front of the other, trusting that my training would guide me through. And as I stumbled out of the forest and onto the gravel road, my body was battered and bruised. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a dull ache in my muscles and a pounding headache. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the landscape, but I barely noticed. I was just relieved to be back on solid ground. I walked the last mile to headquarters in this daze, the events of that day replaying in my mind like some sort of bad dream. And my hands were dirty and scratched, and my clothes hung off of me in these strips, and every step felt heavy, and each breath was very labored. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. The familiar sight of our headquarters provided little comfort, though. It was a small, temporary outpost nestled at the edge of the woods, where we handled administrative tasks and gathered supplies. Inside the main tent, the radios hummed with the usual chatter, but everything seemed muffled and distant. I approached the senior guide who was on duty, and he looked up as I approached, asked me where I'd been, and said that they were all starting to get worried. I tried to speak, but my voice came out hoarse and cracked, though in the end I told them the situation, how the client had seemed normal at first, but then something had snapped, how he attacked me without warning, his eyes wild with his fear and anger, and how I'd managed to escape, running through the woods until I found my way back. I didn't leave out any details, trying to make him understand the gravity of what had occurred. When I finished, the guy just nodded. He didn't even seem surprised. He basically said something like, we get these cases every now and then. People push too hard, they come out here unprepared, and it just sort of breaks them. The wilderness can be very unforgiving. The thought of him coming back filled me with dread, though, but the guide reassured me that they'd send a team to investigate and notify the authorities. He said that I'd done the right thing by escaping, that surviving was all that mattered. And relief sort of washed over me, but it definitely was tangled with a sense of regret. I couldn't stop thinking that I should have done more, noticed something sooner, or acted differently to prevent what had happened. When I finished filling out the incident report, the senior guide took it and briefly reviewed it, then said that they would handle things with the authorities. He reminded me that I was safe now, and that's all that mattered, and I nodded, too shaken to offer much of a response. My mind raced with flashes of the encounter, that man in the woods, and the fear that I felt, a very desperate struggle. I wanted to forget, but I knew that was going to be impossible. And that evening, I just sat alone in the corner of the tent while the other guides carried on with their tasks. My thoughts kept circling back to that moment, the wild, desperate look in his eyes as he lunged at me. I didn't know if he was still out there wandering those woods, but I hoped that he'd be found and taken somewhere safe. Later, the senior guide told me a search party had been sent out looking for him. They would find him, he assured me, but it didn't ease the heaviness in my chest. All I wanted in that moment was to go home and leave all this behind, but I knew the memory would follow me. The job held its dangers, and that day would always be a reminder. I'm a wilderness guide, and I have been for near on 14 years now. And in all that time, there's only one person that I regret taking into the woods. It was late October when I got a call from my boss saying that we had a client coming in. I'd guided plenty of people through the Montana wilderness before, but from the moment I met the German, I knew that this trip was going to be a little different. He was an older man, ordinary enough in appearance, average height, brown hair, a practical jacket and boots. But there was something about the way that he carried himself that set me on edge. He seemed polite but distant, and he rarely spoke. My job was to take him up to a ridge deep in the forest, a place few people ventured to. And he didn't say why he wanted to go there, just that it was important to him, and we'd long since learned not to pry into our clients' affairs. People come out here for all kinds of reasons, to find themselves, to lose themselves, to see something they can't find anywhere else. And most folks are pretty friendly and open, but something about this German made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was the way he acted, calm but insistent. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to already know the route despite hiring me as his guide. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The forest was quiet, with the kind of stillness that you only get in late fall. The leaves were mostly down, covering the ground in damp yellows and browns, and the evergreens stood dark and heavy against the gray sky. The German walked close behind me, and his boots were crunching in rhythm with mine. Every so often, I'd glance back and catch him looking off into the trees like he was expecting to see something there. But then, whenever I asked if everything was all right, he'd just nod or say yes. very quick and abrupt. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it wasn't idle chatter. He mentioned how quiet the forest was and then occasionally said much weirder stuff like how alive it felt even in its stillness. He talked about how places like this seemed untouched by time, how they could make you feel small in the best of ways. His words were thoughtful, but there was sort of a strange edge to them, like he was speaking less to me and more to himself. It was the kind of talk that stays with you even if you don't quite know why. We stopped for lunch near a creek, and the water was kind of low, sluggish and brown with fallen leaves. And I offered him some of my jerky. He refused it, eating his own food quietly, which was wrapped neatly in wax paper. He didn't offer any, and I didn't ask. And there was nothing unusual about it, but the way he ate made me feel uneasy, like I was intruding on something private. As we climbed together, the trees began to thin and the wind began to pick up. It howled through the gaps in the ridgeline, rattling the branches and tugging at my hat, but the German seemed unfazed. He walked steadily, his gaze fixed ahead like he knew exactly where he was going. And the higher we climbed, the quieter the forest became, even the wind seemed muted. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but our steps and the occasional creak of a swaying tree. The ridge came into view in the late afternoon, a jagged line of rocks and scrubby trees silhouetted against the darkening sky. And as we crested the final rise, the landscape opened up and I could see the valley below. There was a house down there, a large ranch house-looking thing nestled in the middle of nowhere. It stood out starkly against the forest surrounding it, and it was the first time I'd ever laid eyes on the place. I pointed it out, expecting the German guy to show some interest, but he barely glanced at it. Instead, his focus remained on the ridge. He told me that he didn't need me to go any further, that I could wait there while he went on alone. Now, I wasn't about to argue. I'd been feeling a growing pressure in my chest since we started the climb, so I was more than happy to stay put while he walked the last 30 feet or so on his own. I watched him as he hiked the final stretch. His movements were steady, deliberate almost, like he was walking towards something he'd been expecting for a long time. When he reached the top, he stood there for a while, looking out over the valley. The wind had died completely and the silence was eerie, to say the least. He didn't seem to care about the view or the mansion below. He just stood there, still as a tree, like he was listening to something only he could hear. When he came back down, his face was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his eyes that was very unsettling to me. It looked darker, deeper, like he'd seen something up there that had changed him. He told me we were done, that I'd done my part and I could head back down. He said he'd follow shortly, but I didn't wait to see if he would. The sun was almost at the horizon as I descended, and the forest grew darker with every step that we took, and the trail felt longer than I remembered, and the trees closer together almost. And by the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, but the night didn't feel empty. It almost felt crowded, like something was moving just out of sight. But I didn't look back, not once. Now, about 2 weeks later, I was finishing dinner when I heard a knock at the door. It was unexpected, and the knock was very firm, too loud for some casual visitor. Now I got up from the table and I went to answer. Standing on the other side were two men in suits who looked to be very serious. And one of them asked if I was me. Now, I don't want to say my own name, but I nodded. And they flashed their badges, telling me that they were FBI. And that's when my heart dropped and my blood started to pump. The taller one spoke first, saying that they needed me to come with them for questioning due to a matter of national security. I asked them what it was about, but the other agent told me that they couldn't say, and he then reiterated that it was urgent, but I could gather my things before leaving. I grabbed my jacket and phone, and they followed me to their black SUV parked out front. And as we drove, I tried to make sense of this situation as my mind was racing with a million different questions. Now, we arrived in an office, where I was led into a small, cold room lit by buzzing fluorescent lights containing a metal table and two chairs. One of the agents stayed with me while the other left. I sat down, my hands resting on the table as the agent across from me opened a folder. The agent asked if I knew why I was there, and I replied honestly that I had no idea. He looked at me closely, as if searching for clues in my expression, and then slid a photograph across the table. It showed a man in his 30s with dark hair and sharp features, and I stared at it, confused, and said I didn't recognize him. The agent continued his cold stare as he questioned me about recent hikes, the people I'd guided, and where I'd been. At least an hour passed, with repeated questions trying to trip me up. Finally, a second agent returned and handed his partner a new photograph, which he placed in front of me. This time, the man in the photo looked older, with graying hair and a very weathered face. It was the German. I told them that he looked like the man that I had guided a few weeks ago, and the agents exchanged a look before asking me for more details about the hike. I explained that he had booked a private hike in Montana with me, didn't say much, and paid in cash. He seemed polite, and we had only discussed the trails, mountains, and wildlife. And after a long, tense period of questioning, the agents seemed to accept my answers. One of them stood up, thanked me for my cooperation, then offered to drive me home. As we headed back, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? Why were they so interested? And when we reached my house, the taller agent handed me a card and said that if I remembered anything else, I was to call that number on the card. I just nodded and took the card and asked if I would hear from them again, and the guy just sort of simply replied, "Possibly." And they drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway. The night was quiet, but my mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my ordinary life had brushed against something much bigger and darker than I could ever understand. I went inside, locked the door, and stared at the card in my hand, wondering who the hell I'd taken on that hike. It had been a very good day. I had led a small group of hikers through one of my favorite trails. They had left hours ago, and now I was enjoying the quiet of the woods, and as I turned a corner, I saw something very strange. At first, I thought it was a shadow or a branch, but as I got closer, I saw it was a person. They were lying still, partly hidden by the plants, and my heart started to race as I dropped my pack and ran to them. It was a man, maybe in his late 30s, wearing hiking clothes. His face seemed to be pale, and his breath was slow, and his skin felt cold and damp. I checked his pulse, but it was weak. I called out, hoping that he would wake up, but he didn't move, and I didn't know what had happened. Maybe he had fallen, or was too thirsty or sick, and I didn't have time to figure it out. He needed help right away, so I grabbed my radio, but I knew this part of the park didn't get good signals. I tried anyway, but it didn't work. The nearest ranger station was over 3 miles away, and the trail was rough, and I had to decide in that moment, leave him and get help, or carry him myself, and I couldn't just leave him there alone. "Okay, let's do this," I said, more to myself than to him, and I used the gear in my pack to make a sling and tied his arms across his chest, and then I lifted him onto my back. He was heavy, but I carried lots of gear on hikes, so I knew that I could do it, adjusting his height, and I started walking. The first part was the hardest. The muscles burned, and the rocky trail made it hard to keep my balance. The sun went down, and it got dark fast. I stopped to get my headlamp, and its light cut through those shadows, helping me see the path. And as I walked, I kept listening to make sure that he was still breathing, and I was glad to hear the faint sound of it. I talked to him as I went, even though I didn't know if he could hear me. "You're doing great," I told him. "We're almost there." The forest at night was noisy in a way that I usually loved. Owls hooted, small animals rustled in the bushes, and crickets chirped, but tonight it felt very lonely. It reminded me of how far we were from help, and the trail felt endless. My legs were tired, and my back ached from his weight, but I didn't stop for long. It was getting colder. I could feel the chill even though I was sweating, and I knew that he must have been freezing. At one point, I slipped on loose gravel and fell to one knee, and this pain shot through my leg, and I thought that I might not be able to keep going. But then I thought of this guy, unconscious and depending solely on me. It caused me to get up, shift his weight, and kept walking. I finally, after what felt like forever, saw the lights of the ranger station, and relief gave me the energy to make it the rest of the way, and I stumbled into the clearing and shouted for help. 2 rangers ran out, looking surprised and worried. I told them that I found this guy on the trail, that he was unconscious, and that his breathing was shallow. The rangers quickly laid him on a stretcher and checked him. One called for an ambulance, and the other started first aid, and I just sat on a bench, completely exhausted. They told me I did a good job, and I just nodded, too tired to speak. As I watched them work, I felt a very strange mix of feelings. I was glad that he was in safe hands now, but I was worried about what had happened to him, and I felt thankful that I had the strength to carry him and the training to help. Later, I sat in the kitchen with a hot cup of coffee. One of the rangers came to tell me that he was dehydrated and overheated, but was stable. They told me I did good, and I just said, I'm doing my job. That night, laying on a cot that they set up for me, I just stared at the ceiling. I felt proud. The wilderness had tested me, and I had done what needed to be done. And this is why I became a guide, not just to show people the beauty of nature, but to help them when they need it most. On Sunday, May 19, 1996, 24-year-old Julie Williams and 26-year-old Laura Winans embarked on a hiking trip through the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Accompanied by their golden retriever, Taj, the pair planned to spend a few days enjoying the tranquility of the park. Their journey, however, ended tragically as they were brutally murdered at their campsite. Despite initial suspicions pointing towards a man from Columbia, Maryland, the case against him fell apart, leaving the crime unsolved for years. It wasn't until June of 2024, 28 years after the murders, that authorities announced a significant breakthrough. Reevaluating the evidence and conducting advanced DNA testing revealed that a convicted rapist, Walter Leo Jackson Sr., who was already deceased, was responsible for the brutal slayings of Julie and Laura. His identity as the perpetrator behind the crime in this otherwise serene park was confirmed, finally providing a measure of closure for the victims' families. Laura Lolly Winans was born into a privileged family in Michigan, but chose a different path in life. Friends described her as a down-to-earth person and very adventurous. And after dropping out of college, Lolly moved to Maine in 1994, where she attended Unity College and worked as a wilderness guide. Known for her love of microbrews, fish, and the outdoors, Lolly was unapologetically herself, embracing a lifestyle far removed from societal expectations. Julie Williams, who preferred to be called Julie, was passionate about sports and geology. A high achiever, she won the Minnesota State Double Tennis Championship in high school and traveled to Europe in college to study dinosaur extinction. Graduating summa cum laude, Julie was fluent in Spanish and worked at a bookstore in Burlington, Vermont. She was about to begin a new job in Lake Champlain, Vermont, when tragedy struck. The two women met at Woods Women, Inc., a nonprofit organization focusing on education and adventure travel for women based out of Minneapolis. It was at this charity in 1994 that they forged a bond, sharing a love for hiking and the outdoors. Woods Women, Inc. was often referred to as the grandmother of women's outdoor adventure groups, having served over 8,000 women and 1,200 children from 1977 to 1999. Their tagline, "Adventure is the best souvenir," perfectly encapsulated their shared passion. The relationship blossomed despite their different backgrounds, and the couple's love for hiking and spending time in the outdoors was a common thread that brought them together. On May 19th, after a day of walking, Julie and Lolly pitched their tent off one of the Shenandoah National Park's horse trails, settling down for the night. They chose a peaceful spot next to the mountain stream near the Bridle Trail, a section of the horse trail system that runs from Big Meadows to Skyland. Shenandoah National Park, founded on December 26th of 1935, stretches over 100 miles along the Blue Ridge Mountains. Located between the Shenandoah Valley in the west and the Piedmont region in the east, the park covers 197,411 acres, including mountain streams, more than 500 miles of hiking trails, and nearly 80,000 acres of designated wilderness. Skyline Drive, constructed in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, offered 105 miles of scenic overlooks, trailheads, picnic areas, and campgrounds. Another popular way to explore the park is by hiking the Appalachian Trail, which runs across the park for about 100 miles. The park was busy that Memorial Day weekend, with hikers and sightseers enjoying the natural beauty. It was on May 31st that Thomas Williams, Julie's father, contacted the authorities to report the women missing after they failed to return from their hike. Park rangers set out to search the area, finding the car parked near Skyland Lodge. And the search quickly focused on nearby trails, and they found Taj, the golden retriever, wandering without a leash. However, there was no sign of Julie or Lolly. Bridget Bonnet, Deputy Chief Ranger at Shenandoah National Park, recalled the frantic efforts to locate the women. We started doing hasty searches to cover all of those trail corridors in that general area to see if we could locate them. But at some point during those hasty searches, we did locate the dog, Bonnet said. It wasn't until June 1st of 1996 that searchers discovered a campsite about half a mile from the vehicle with the two bodies. The women were later identified as Julie and Lolly. National Park Service lead investigator Tim Alley described the grisly scene. Lolly was found inside the tent, gagged, her hands bound with duct tape, the same tape used to gag Julie, and her throat slit. Unlike Julie, her ankles were also bound. Both women were partially undressed, yet there was no evidence of sexual assault, no semen was found at the scene, and Julie's body, sleeping bag, and pad were found around 30 to 40 feet away down a little embankment. The discovery was complicated by Shenandoah National Park's backcountry regulations, which required backpackers to camp away from designated trails, fire roads, and developed areas. It wasn't a heavily used or heavily traveled trail. They followed the backcountry regulations, then requiring them to be out of sight, Bonnet explained. A camera with photos of their hike along with White Oak Canyon Trail was found at the camp. A few days after entering the park, they also climbed Hawksbill, the highest mountain in Shenandoah, just before pitching camp for the last time. The National Park Service waited 36 hours after the discovery to announce the murders, despite the fact that the park was full of visitors who could have been at risk. When the announcement was finally made, Acting Park Superintendent Greg Stiles called it an isolated incident, without providing any basis for such a statement. The FBI later categorized the murders as random. Solving the crime was a daunting task, given the high number of visitors to the park in 1996, 1.57 million people. Shenandoah National Park's law enforcement authority rested exclusively with the federal government. The park's law enforcement staff, in collaboration with the FBI and Virginia State Police's crime scene unit, secured the crime scene and began investigating. Special agents combed through evidence, photos, and interviews, working tirelessly with the Virginia State Police to process the crime scene given the lack of equipment at the time. A disturbing parallel to the murders of Julie and Lolly occurred on July 9, 1997, when Yvonne Malbasha, a tourist from Canada, was attacked while cycling on Skyline Drive. Separated from her friend, Malbasha was forced off the road and nearly abducted by Daryl David Rice, a man with no previous criminal record. Rice was apprehended trying to leave the park, and his vehicle was found to contain hand and leg restraints, indicating predatory behavior. Rice was in his late 20s, single and living in Columbia, Maryland. At the time of his arrest, he was working at Maryland's MCI System House, but he was fired in June 1997 due to hostile behavior. Colleagues reported that Rice was aggressive and had a history of erratic behavior, including stealing lunches, damaging property, and making inappropriate comments to coworkers. This behavior, coupled with his location and selection of female victims, led investigators to suspect him in the murders of Julie and Lolly. Surveillance videos showed Rice entering the park on May 25th and May 26th, around the time Julie and Lolly disappeared. He denied being in the park on these days, but admitted to being there on June 1st. The circumstantial evidence mounted against him, and on April 10, 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft announced Rice's indictment in the murder of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. Prosecutors alleged that Rice enjoyed assaulting women because they were more vulnerable, and that he harbored disdain for LGBTQ individuals, claiming the women deserved to die for their perceived sexual orientation. In 1999, the FBI placed an undercover agent with Rice at the Federal Corrections Center in Petersburg, Virginia, where the agent recorded conversations that provided further insight into Rice's mindset. In one recorded conversation, Rice admitted to limited relationships with women and expressed a preference for pornography, which he substituted for meaningful human interactions. Fellow inmates described him as deeply immersed in adult content, with alleging that he possessed magazines featuring BDSM imagery. Despite this mounting evidence, including a hair found at the crime scene that was tested and did not match Rice, the case struggled to make progress due to the lack of forensic evidence linking him directly to the murders. In October 2003, a new DNA test developed for Y-STRs, Y chromosome short tandem repeats, showed that DNA on the duct tape used to bind Lolly's wrist did not match Rice's DNA, and this raised significant doubts about his involvement. Without strong forensic evidence, the defense was able to successfully challenge the circumstantial case against Rice. The defense highlighted several issues: statements made by a couple camping in the park the night that the women were murdered, a phone call Rice made to a gay rights center in California, an audio tape submitted by the government, and alleged attempts by investigators to manipulate witnesses who saw the women in the park. The case fell apart, and on February 25, 2004, Judge Moon dismissed the charges against Rice without prejudice, meaning that he could still be charged at a later date. The loss of 2 lives serves as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the most peaceful places. As authorities continue their investigation, their families are left grappling with the unimaginable grief. Julie and Laura's story highlights the need for vigilance and safety while exploring the wilderness. Though the trails may grow quiet again, the memory of their tragedy will not fade for those left behind. In 2016, seasoned hiker and wilderness guide Chris Fowler set out to complete the Pacific Crest Trail. Known as the PCT, the 2,650-mile-long trail stretches from the state of Washington to the Mexican border, and traversing it had been one of Fowler's lifelong dreams. He was 30 years of age when he began his journey, and he was said to have relished the opportunity to challenge himself both mentally and physically. As a former military man, he had adapted to a life of routine and discipline. Then as a civilian, Chris developed a longing to venture further afield than his desk job in the grocery store. Friends and family described him as someone who was always prepared for any situation, with a well-planned gear list and a careful approach to navigation. Fowler was also careful to log his journey on social media so that friends and family would know his rough location at any one time. But when Chris's routine documentation suddenly stopped, his loved ones began to grow concerned. The PCT stretches through some of the most remote and rugged terrain in the entire United States and presents a unique set of challenges to even the most experienced hikers. It's not unheard of for people to suffer mishaps while traveling along it, with potential causes ranging from falls to exposure to wildlife encounters. Fowler, on the other hand, appears to have suffered something much more sinister and unexplainable. He started his journey at the trail's southern terminus on April 9th of 2016, near the small town of Campo, California. He made steady progress for the first 3 weeks, posting photos and videos to his social media pages, and was believed to be hitting his various distance goals quite comfortably. However, on May 3rd, Fowler's social media went dark. The last message that he sent was to a fellow hiker that he had met on the trail, saying that he was near a popular spot among the trail in Northern California called Castle Crags. This marked the first time Fowler's progress seemed to wane, as he was at least a few days behind his intended pace. And after that, his social media activity ceased, no further messages were sent, and his phone went silent. By mid-May, when Fowler failed to check in with his friends and family, their concerns began to grow. His parents then contacted Northern California's Shasta County Sheriff's Department, and after explaining their situation, local deputies formed the vanguard of the subsequent search and rescue effort. For weeks on end, California SNR teams scoured the area surrounding Castle Crags, in the hopes of finding a clue to Fowler's whereabouts. Aerial searches, ground sweeps, and even trained sniffing dogs were deployed, but frustratingly, all efforts were fruitless. Fowler's disappearance was puzzling, not only because of his vast experience as an outdoorsman, but also because there were no signs of struggle or distress at the locations he was known to have visited. To some, it was as if Chris Fowler had simply vanished. As the investigation continued, several theories and possible explanations began to emerge. The first involved Fowler taking an impromptu detour from the trail, possibly to visit a nearby town or to explore another section of the trail. But without any sightings of him or evidence of habitation in the areas in question, such a theory seems improbable at best. Another less credible theory involves Fowler suffering some kind of accident or fall, which the resulting wounds either killed him instantly or rendered him immobile. Yet despite a long and far-reaching search effort, no trace of his remains or equipment were ever recovered. This is when some investigators began to suspect Chris had fallen victim to some kind of violent criminal. The Pacific Crest Trail, while generally safe, passes through areas known for transient populations, including hikers, campers, and even criminals. who have been known to shelter among the Cascades or the Sierra Nevada when wanted by the law. No evidence of violence or criminal activity was found at any of the locations Fowler was known to have visited, but as many have pointed out, this doesn't preclude the possibility that Chris was forced, quite possibly at gunpoint, to divert from his planned route without a struggle. Perhaps one of the most frustrating aspects of Fowler's disappearance was the complete lack of substantial forensic evidence. Not a single item of his personal belongings was ever found, and considering he was carrying his entire life in an 80-liter, 40-pound backpack, this is curious to say the least. Fowler's tent, ground sheet, sleeping bag, and spare changes of clothes were never recovered, and neither were his cooking gear, his navigation equipment, or his food and water. None of Fowler's toiletries were ever recovered, nor were his sunglasses, his phone, or the portable charging banks that he used to keep it powered. Fowler carried a number of additional items too, but again, despite such an extensive list of possessions, not a single one of them was ever recovered from the search and rescue team's extensive area of operations. The lack of evidence fueled speculation regarding Fowler's death or potential abduction. But without a body or direct witness, investigators were left only with disparate theories. Adding to the complexity were the challenges of searching such a vast and unforgiving landscape. The Pacific Crest Trail cuts through dense forests, alpine meadows, and remote stretches where mobile phone signals are weak or non-existent. Such rough terrain proved a great hindrance to search and rescue efforts, while regional weather proved an equally formidable foe. Weather conditions among the Pacific mountain ranges are known to change rapidly, with fast-moving weather fronts sometimes obscuring a hiker's visibility. Coupled with terrain quite easily capable of leading someone astray, such a turn could have proven fatal to even the most experienced outdoorsman. Despite the extensive search, it was as if Fowler had slipped through the cracks of the wilderness, leaving no trace whatsoever behind. Years went by, but Fowler's case was not forgotten. His parents continued to appeal for information, keeping his disappearance in the public eye through social media campaigns and tear-jerking media interviews. And once a year, around the anniversary of Chris's disappearance, friends and family organized hikes in his memory, hoping that someone might have new information or come forward with a clue. But as of the time of writing this, the case remains open. Some theories persist, ranging from the possibility of a tragic accident to the idea that Fowler could have chosen to disappear deliberately. However, there has been no concrete evidence to support such claims, and neither is there any proof that Chris was attacked or abducted. Chris Fowler's story is a stark reminder of the risks involved when venturing into the wild. It underscores the importance of preparation, the need for communication while on the trail, and the challenges faced by law enforcement when trying to solve cases in remote areas. For those who knew him, Chris remains a symbol of resilience and an enduring mystery, a reminder that even the most experienced adventurers can disappear without a trace. While the answers to what happened to Chris Fowler may never be fully known, his story continues to prompt questions about safety in the wilderness and the thin line between exploration and danger. Nestled in the rugged beauty of Montana, Gallatin National Forest has long been a sanctuary for nature lovers and outdoor enthusiasts. Spanning over 2 million acres, its dense forests, rushing rivers, and remote trails offer a breathtaking escape from modern life. However, in the summer of 2005, the serene wilderness became the backdrop for a chilling crime that remains etched into local memory: the Gallatin National Forest murder. On August 14, 2005, a seasoned wilderness guide, Mark Hendricks, was leading a small group of hikers on a multi-day trek through the forest's remote trails. An early riser, Hendricks often scouted ahead to ensure the path was safe for his group. That morning, as the sun's rays pierced through the towering pine trees, Hendricks noticed something unusual near a clearing by the Gallatin River. Strewn across the forest floor were signs of a hastily abandoned campsite, a smoldering fire pit, a scattered sleeping bag, and a tipped-over camp chair. A few steps further, Hendricks stumbled upon a horrifying scene. A man, later identified as 32-year-old Ethan Grant, lay lifeless near the riverbank. His body bore multiple stab wounds and his throat had been slashed. Blood splatter patterns on nearby rocks and foliage indicated a violent struggle. Ethan Grant, a freelance journalist from Denver, Colorado, was known for his passion for outdoor adventures and his knack for storytelling. He had come to Gallatin National Forest to work on a piece about solo wilderness camping, a trend gaining popularity among thrill seekers. Friends described Grant as meticulous and cautious, someone who meticulously planned his trips and carried an arsenal of survival gear. Local law enforcement and the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department took the lead in the investigation with the assistance from the FBI due to the possibility of interstate elements. Initial evidence collected at the scene included a bloodied hunting knife found partially submerged in the river and footprints leading away from the campsite. Forensic analysis revealed no fingerprints on the knife, but DNA from the blood on its blade matched Grant's. Further investigation of Grant's belongings, including his tent, journal, and camera, provided few clues. His journal entries stopped abruptly on the evening of August 12th, suggesting the attack occurred later that night. Witness statements soon provided investigators with a potential lead. A day before Grant's murder, two hikers, Sarah Mills and Jake Porter, reported encountering a suspicious man on the nearby trail. They described him as disheveled, carrying a large backpack and acting aggressively when they declined his request for food and cigarettes. The man, later identified as 45-year-old Thomas Blake, was a transient known to frequent the area. Blake had a history of petty crimes, including theft and assault, and was known to harbor a deep mistrust of authorities. Investigators learned that he had been seen in Gallatin National Forest during the week of the murder. A search of local shelters and encampments eventually led to his arrest on August 18th. Under questioning, Blake initially denied any involvement in Grant's murder. However, inconsistencies in his story and mounting evidence forced his hand. Investigators found traces of blood on his shirt and his backpack that matched Grant's DNA. Blake eventually confessed, claiming he acted in self-defense after a confrontation with Grant. Blake alleged that he had approached Grant's campsite seeking food and shelter, but the encounter turned hostile when Grant refused. According to Blake, a physical altercation ensued, during which he grabbed Grant's hunting knife and stabbed him in a panic. Forensic evidence, however, contradicted parts of Blake's account, suggesting a premeditated attack. Thomas Blake's trial began in early 2006 and captivated the local community. Prosecutors painted a picture of a desperate man who targeted Grant out of anger and envy. They argued that Grant's refusal to help Blake triggered a violent outburst, leading to a brutal and unprovoked attack. The defense, meanwhile, clung to the self-defense narrative, citing Blake's transient lifestyle and lack of resources as mitigating factors. After 2 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Blake guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The Gallatin National Forest murder left a lasting impact on the outdoor community. Grant's death served as a grim reminder of the potential dangers of solo camping, no matter how prepared or experienced one might be. In the years following the crime, wilderness safety programs emphasized the importance of staying in groups, carrying communication devices, and being cautious of strangers. For Mark Hendricks, the discovery of Grant's body marked a turning point in his career. Though he continued to lead wilderness treks, he became a vocal advocate for safety and security in remote areas. "The wilderness is beautiful," Hendricks later said in an interview, "but it's not just the elements you have to be prepared for. It's the people you might encounter." To this day, visitors to Gallatin National Forest occasionally leave flowers and mementos at the clearing where Ethan Grant's life was tragically cut short. His story remains a cautionary tale of the delicate balance between adventure and caution in the wild. Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher of Baker, was one of the most chilling serial killers in Alaskan history. Born on February 15th of 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, Hansen's life was marked by a troubling combination of personal struggles, a rigid upbringing, and an insatiable thirst for control and domination. Hansen grew up in a strict household, dominated by a disciplinarian father who pushed him into long hours of work at the family bakery. As a shy, acne-ridden teenager with a severe stutter, Hansen was often the target of bullying and rejection. These experiences, particularly by girls, left deep scars, fostering resentment and fantasies of revenge. In 1967, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska, seeking a fresh start. By day, he appeared to be a mild-mannered baker, married with 2 children and well-liked by the local community. But beneath the surface, he harbored dark desires that would manifest in horrifying ways. Hansen began committing petty crimes in the 1970s, including arson and theft, which earned him brief stints in jail. However, these offenses were merely the prelude to his descent into a far more sinister pattern. Using his seemingly ordinary persona as a cover, Hansen developed a method to abduct young women, predominantly sex workers and dancers from Anchorage's streets. He would lure them with the promise of money or jobs before overpowering them. His modus operandi was uniquely sadistic. Hansen would fly his victims in his private plane to the remote wilderness of the Knik River under the pretense of being a wilderness guide. However, once in a suitably remote location, he would release them into the wild and hunt them down like animals, fulfilling his twisted fantasies of dominance and control. This gruesome practice earned him the nickname The Hunter. Hansen's reign of terror persisted for over a decade, with at least 17 confirmed murders between 1971 and 1983. The remoteness of the Alaskan wilderness served as the perfect cover, allowing him to commit these atrocities without detection. The victims' remains were often discovered years later, their skeletal remains scattered across the rugged terrain, marked on Hansen's personal aviation map with small X's. Despite his cunning, Hansen's downfall began in 1983, when a young woman named Cindy Paulson escaped his clutches. Paulson, a 17-year-old sex worker, managed to flee Hansen's home after he had brutally assaulted and restrained her. She flagged down a passing truck and provided detailed information to the police, including a description of Hansen and his home. Initially, Hansen denied any involvement, relying on his reputation as a quiet, church-going baker to deflect suspicion. However, detectives' persistence, combined with Paulson's testimony, began to unravel his carefully constructed facade. A search warrant executed on Hansen's home revealed damning evidence: firearms matching bullets found at crime scenes, jewelry belonging to victims, and Hansen's aviation map with marked locations that corresponded to known burial sites. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Hansen eventually confessed to murdering 17 women and assaulting dozens more. He provided investigators with chilling details about his crimes, showing no remorse for his actions. In 1984, he was sentenced to 461 years plus life without the possibility of parole. Hansen's crimes sent shockwaves through the Anchorage community and beyond, sparking widespread fear and horror. People struggled to reconcile the image of the unassuming baker with the monstrous predator he truly was. His story also shed light on the vulnerabilities of marginalized women, particularly sex workers who often lack the protection and advocacy needed to ensure their safety. The investigation into Hansen's crimes became a pivotal case for Alaskan law enforcement. The meticulous work of investigators, including the use of psychological profiling and the willingness to believe the testimony of a young, traumatized victim, highlighted the importance of pursuing justice, no matter how elusive or unlikely it seemed. The case also underscored the value of forensic science, as evidence collected from Hansen's home and crime scenes played a critical role in securing his conviction. Cindy Paulson, whose bravery ultimately led to Hansen's capture, became a symbol of resilience. Her harrowing escape and willingness to testify against her abuser demonstrated incredible courage. Her actions not only brought an end to Hansen's killing spree, but also gave voice to countless victims who could no longer speak for themselves. In the years following Hansen's conviction, the story of his crimes had been retold in books, documentaries, and even a feature film, The Frozen Ground, starring Nicolas Cage and John Cusack. These retellings serve as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath seemingly ordinary lives. Robert Hansen died in 2014 at the age of 75. His story continues to haunt Alaska, a stark reminder of the evil that once lurked in its wilderness. The legacy of his crimes underscores the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the relentless pursuit of justice in the face of unimaginable horrors. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Bigfoot has big sagging hangers in the Patterson film.